used are conditional use. So the intent of this petition is to remove the conditional use proposal and change that to the optional design project proposal. And I'll be reviewing that in future slides. But currently, as you may remember from our ADU presentation, conditional uses can have a significant upfront expense with them. From the petition cost to the signage, to the advertising, to attorney's fees to take you through the hearings examiner process, to engineering fees to draft plans, as well as the time it takes to do that. The optional design process would be different in terms of there would be no upfront petition cost, and there would be no upfront advertising. There still may be a necessity for attorney and engineering fees, and the time would hopefully be much smoother once you have a project that's able to be processed, narrowing that window down to more of the 3-month time frame or less. So this slide depicts currently where our allowed RAAH by right, and as you can see, the 7 zoning districts mostly are within the planned service area and to the east, kind of spread out throughout that part of this part of Howard County. And then conditional use is a much broader allowance within terms of zoning districts. As I said, there's 13 zoning districts where we can have conditional uses for ARAH. And then this map depicts the existing approved conditional use, which we have not had that many conditional use approvals for ARAH. They're scattered throughout, mostly again in the east, and these are existing age-restricted adult housing within the conditional use approved districts. So now, how would ZRA 224 allow cottage clusters, and where would they be allowed? So under the proposal, ARAH would only be permitted within the planned service area. So on this map, everything to the east of the orange line, so all of the red areas, and this would impact approximately 55,651 parcels for an acreage of 32,723 acres. So that sounds like a lot. However, as you begin to narrow it down within the planned service area, within the minimum lot size of 20,000 gross square feet, and then looking at these to be mainly infill development potential, our criteria for where we believe these to be most feasible, given that we do not have a lot of opportunity for greenfield development, and we're really looking for this particular zoning regulation amendment to fulfill missing middle housing and infill opportunities. We looked at under-improved and unimproved parcels that met the criteria of 20,000 square feet or greater up until 10 acres, which is the maximum acreage the proposal, the zoning regulation amendment would allow these particular cottage cluster locations. So once you take all of that into account, it really only equates to feasibly 778 acres being affected or 921 parcels. And as you can see, they're kind of strewn about within the planned service area inside the PSA to the eastern portion of the county. This chart depicts where ARAH are currently allowed as a conditional use. The intent of this proposal is to move them from a conditional use approval to a permitted by right, utilizing only the optional design process. The optional design process would allow similar guardrails as a conditional use without having to go to the hearings examiner, rather the planning board for approval. And I'll walk through the steps of what that would be like. So again, this proposal adds a new definition of cottage clusters. It amends the definition for optional design projects. We currently allow optional design projects in the county within our CR overlay district. So this would amend that allowance to go beyond the CR district as a potential use. Amends the permitted by right uses within the planned golf course community for cottage cluster inclusion. and creates a new subsection of the supplemental zoning regulations where it establishes a criteria for these cottage clusters with optional design projects. And then also adds to our age-restricted adult housing, adds them to the parking regulations. So optional design projects are currently used for economic development purposes, mainly along the Route 1 corridor. This proposal changes that by expanding it to be utilized with age-restricted adult housing for the cottage cluster purpose specifically. The parcels that are in the proposal must be located within the planned service area for water and sewer, so these would not be allowed in our well and septic areas. Again, we already talked about the zoning districts where they would be allowed. The minimum development area for these projects would be a minimum of about a half acre or 20,000 gross square feet, with a maximum development area of 10 gross acres. And again, the idea to have these as infill development opportunities as opposed to large parcel assemblage for larger communities to be developed. Cottage cluster dwellings are going to be limited to age-restricted adult housing and would require going to the design advisory panel prior to the site development plan phase and being submitted for optional design project process. So going back to what is an optional design project, it is currently defined in our zoning as an alternative development process where the developer works with the Department of Planning and Zoning to draft permitted uses, land regulations, design, and other characteristics subject to the approval of planning board. So again, with conditional use, it's subject to the approval of the hearings examiner. This would change that to approval from the planning board, which again, this is already currently found in our zoning regulations under 121 for commercial redevelopment CR district. So again, this is not a new process that we're adding, we're just utilizing it in a different way from our current zoning code. So under our current optional design project process and how it's currently utilized, an owner of a parcel zone CR must have a minimum of lot size of 1 to 3 acres, 1 acre or 3 acres if it's a motor vehicle fueling station. And I'll go over the current, we only have one ODP project that's been approved in the county. It happens to be a motor vehicle fueling station. Prior to filing a formal application, the plan should be presented to DAP for evaluation. Again, making sure that it follows good form and function of design. And the applicant must include a plan which depicts all the natural existing and current development features, proposed structures, uses, setbacks, landscaping, architectural elevations, etc. So all the things that you would typically see, including architectural elevation in any typical site plan. The owner, when they apply for our current ODP process, shall provide written justification of how they conform with the district, how it will enhance the surrounding community, how the county will benefit via this proposal than a typical conventional zoning proposal on that same property. And then once it's submitted to planning and zoning, we'll review the proposal to make sure all of the boxes have been checked and it's a complete submitted application like we do for all of our projects. And then we'll work with the applicant for a formal meeting that will be scheduled to kind of go over what this proposal is. Once we determine, again, that the proposal is suitably in conformance with the purpose of the district, we'll schedule a site review committee review meeting. This is typically done when we have our site development process. Typical of after a cycle of review, we review it with our allied agencies and sister agencies within the county to go over, does the plan meet the appropriate criteria as it's basically an approvable site plan without having gone through that process yet. We make that determination because this will be the plan on which the zoning will be based on. Once the petitioner has indicated to DPC that they wish to pursue this proposal, then we're going to schedule a planning board hearing date. So again, this will be a hearing via the planning board. And during this, the planning board will be able to approve with amendments or deny the proposal altogether. And again, via the analysis, just as you would see with any typical site plan, you would have a description of the site, permitted uses, setbacks, site improvements, environmental considerations, landscaping, stormwater management, forest conservation, adequate road facilities. And then the planning board, as they do, will issue a decision in order containing the formal decision of the proposal, and anything needs to be changed. So again, as I said, we only have one project where the ODP process has been used, where it's been very underutilized within the county along the Route 1 corridor. So again, the purpose of this proposal is to expand beyond that. So for this, the project that we are giving the example on was approved in 2017. It went through the required DAP and SRC approvals, and then had a planning board hearing that lasted 3 planning board dates to determine the appropriateness of the ODP application. And this is the outcome, is a typical site plan that then would be followed through the site development process, where you're looking at the property itself, its perimeter landscaping, its internal parking and movement within the site for pedestrian and automobile movement throughout the site, the buildings and where they would be placed, as well as where all the other facilities and utilities would be arranged within this site. So again, the planning board has 3 criteria under the current ODP process. And that criteria is to review the development that benefits the surrounding residential and businesses, to encourage a vibrant marketplace, to encourage the most favorable arrangement of buildings, parking, vehicle circulation, pedestrian circulation, public areas, etc. In this case, because this was applied along Route 1, also to meet the design standards of the Route 1 manual, and the provision of a high quality architectural and site design that minimizes isolated buildings, pads, sites, and presents a positive image on or along Route 1. So again, this is specific to the Route 1 corridor. The planning board also had to look at the development of a mixture of commercial land uses based on market conditions, the site characteristics, and the current intended future character of the development, and encourage the project, which involved the assembly and redevelopment of the greatest number of parcels. Again, this was the idea along Route 1, what is again to redevelop and make Route 1 more cohesive in its assemblage of parcels along the corridor. So now, moving to our cottage cluster, in that same vein, this was to allow the optional design project, but to utilize it for a different purpose. And this is for the age-restricted portion of cottage cluster. And the reason, as I said earlier, we did this as opposed to conditional uses for a multitude of reasons. So obviously having to go through the hearings examiner process, that would no longer be needed. You can't do both. We can't have this be a conditional use with the ODP. So that way, one would not conflict with the other. This way, the ODP then acts as similarly to a conditional use by setting where the buildings would be and all the conditions upon which the development would be allowed to proceed forward under the regulations. So again, for this proposal, we are limiting this only to age-restricted adult housing. So the petition would have to meet the similar criteria that we have right now for age-restricted adult housing, or when you come in with one of those particular projects, you have to have your proposed deed restrictions or covenants on how you will establish the age restrictions required under our current code definitions. And in addition, if the development will not be a rental community, if under a single ownership, then if it's for purchase, a community association or homeowners association shall be established to maintain and enforce the age restrictions, as well as because these are more communal properties as opposed to individual lots. They would also be responsible for the common areas of the community, is the intent of the legislation. Other parts of the optional design and the cottage cluster requirements are that the landscape character of the site must blend with the adjacent residential development. So again, when these projects come through with their site development plan, we would expect to see on that plan grading and landscaping shall retain and enhance elements that allow the site to blend with compatibility with the adjacent residential developments. And that an architectural transition of buildings near the perimeter that are similar to the neighboring dwellings are in scale, material, architectural detail demonstrated by the architectural elevations and renderings submitted to the petition. So again, the idea here is that when these cottage clusters come in, they would be reviewed by the design advisory panel, who would inform the planning board of how well do the architectural elevations blend with the surrounding community, should adjustments be made. The idea is to not have these be a jarring community as an infill development set in, but rather something that subtly blends into the existing community. One thing I do want to point out, looking at the additional buffering along the perimeter of the site, through retention of existing forest or landscaping, enhanced landscaping, berms, and increased setbacks. I think one of the recommendations that we would be discussing with the planning board is to maybe change the verbiage here. Different from the proposal. We've heard from some in the community, given that these are small properties, starting at 20,000 square feet, going up to 10 acres. Looking at this additional buffering actually may be out of character with the community by creating too much of a buffer. It may not blend in as nicely or seamlessly, especially with berms or things like that, that would be meant to act as a guardrail, may actually act to obstruct the view and the flow of the community for this infill type development. So again, the optional design plan and architectural design of the building shall have been reviewed by the design advisory panel. All open space and common areas related to improvement shall be managed and maintained by a common entity. We also look at loading and storage of trash areas should be adequately screened from view of these particular projects. So really getting just some specifics of what we'd like to see come through with these particular plans. And then the big thing and what this is all based on is that the development shall include a common courtyard scheme as we depicted in some of the drawings that I showed earlier. And that the dwelling units shall be oriented uniformly around that common courtyard, whether they're rear facing or front facing. The intent is to have that common community space adjacent to the dwelling units. And then the size will be determined of the common courtyard, looking at a basic 250 square feet per dwelling unit surrounding that area. So that way, the more dwellings you have along the common courtyard, the larger the courtyard shall be. The courtyard and other open space area should provide for amenities such as pathways, seating areas, and recreation for the residents. And shall be protective of natural features, but this should not be used for your above ground stormwater management or to meet other types of requirements on site. This is meant to be the communal yard area for the homes that are adjacent and abutting it. Another feature I want to point out with the zoning regulation amendment is there will be no MIH requirements because again, the intent is to have these as naturally affordable units. And the reason we drafted the language this way was to actually discourage having things such as major amenities, which can make sites unaffordable. So gyms, pools, sports courts, clubhouses, and other constructed outdoor recreational facilities, anything that's above the 3,500 square foot mark. So the minimum size of a constructed amenity area shall be at least 500 square feet with a cumulative area of no more than 3,500 square feet. So when you get to adding all of those things, then a 20% MIHU requirement will be imposed because again, you're adding for making, since this becomes more unaffordable, the more amenities you had and the more HOA fees that could be incurred or just development fees in general starts moving out of the realm of affordability. In addition, looking at the bulk requirements, having a maximum height of 20 feet for the principal structures. And then I want to point out that the minimum structure and use setbacks from the project boundary are 50 feet. Again, we've heard from some in the community that given the small size and that these are meant to be infill properties, that perhaps 50 feet is too onerous and this should be reduced in order to make these projects fit in a little bit better. Because when you take 50 around 3 to 4 sides of these particular properties, plus a 25-foot public right-of-way setback, you really start limiting the potential for the internal development of this site. Another feature I want to point out, we talked a little bit about this in the definition, is that the cottage cluster shall have a footprint of less than or equal to 900 square feet. So the actual facility itself, or dwelling unit itself, is not limited to the maximum extent of 900 square feet. You can have a basement and you can have a second floor. However, the footprint itself can be no larger than that. And also maximum densities have also been established within the regulations from 9 maximum units per acre to 20 maximum net units per acre in the RA 15 and RAPT districts. Again, moving to accessory structures, this will not allow for accessory structures or uses that shall be permitted within the development except for those amenity areas constructed for the community. Meaning each individual unit, since it's communal space, will not have its own sheds be allowed and other accessory structures that you would see in a single family detached or attached particular structure. Planning and zoning have guidelines identified for universal design features. So the petition shall include descriptions of design features of proposed dwellings to demonstrate their appropriateness for the age-restricted population. The material submitted shall indicate how universal design features will be used to make individual dwellings adaptable to persons with mobility or functional limitations, and how the design will provide accessible routes between parking areas, sidewalks, dwellings, and common areas. So again, here are some examples of cottage clusters. Again, on the upper left corner, you can see an already constructed community. Again, with that pathway feature and courtyard up to the rear of the house here. Another rendering of a cottage courtyard. This one's a little bit bigger than 900 square feet, but just to kind of show you what a community could look like. And then down below, you can see what this would look like within a pocket neighborhood where you have existing single family residences and then parking spaces, as well as your common building, community garden, and a central common space in the middle. We also wanted to give some examples of what the dwellings could look like. So here are some typical floor plans that we were able to pull of a 900 square foot home. And I know it seems pretty small, but actually, you know, given the right design internally and layout, you can fit all the functioning amenities that you need for your living arrangement, especially if you're a single person or maybe 2 people living in a home. So you would have a parking area. You'd be able to ingress from the parking area, and you would walk in and you could have a living area with, you'd be able to fit furniture nicely and have seated kitchen area, as well as a kitchen and 2 bathrooms where you would have 2 bathrooms associated with the 2 bedrooms in that space. There's also another ground floor plan that shows, again, no parking lot facility or parking pad facility, but does have 2 bedrooms, bathrooms, a dining area, a kitchen area as well. And then a third where you could have 2 floors, so you could have a bedroom on the first floor for first floor living, as well as 2 additional bedrooms and a bathroom, and a lounge area on a second floor. So even though they are small, they can have a lot of nice amenities and features on the inside. So they're small but mighty units that really can perform a really lovely function for affordability, naturally affordable housing within the county. So what our neighbors are doing. So right now, Anne Arundel County has just passed tiny house legislation, cottage cluster community developments. Montgomery County does not have the cottage cluster or tiny homes, but they do have accessory dwelling units that have a minimum 320 square feet size. Frederick County allows for ADUs and tiny homes, as well as Baltimore County allows for tiny homes on wheels within their mobile home parks within the county. So some additional resources to follow the zoning regulation amendment can be found on our webpage under planning and zoning, as well as we are also finishing up our missing middle webpage, which will have references to accessory dwelling units in addition to cottage clusters on that webpage as well. So the next steps for this legislation is there will be a planning board meeting this Thursday, April 9th. We encourage anyone that has comments to please come to that planning board meeting, hear their discussion and provide any additional information you'd like to the planning board. Nothing with council has been submitted, but hopefully this legislation will be pre-filed on April 23rd for June 2nd consideration. So with that, we have 25 minutes. I'm going to move to our submitted question phase. So we heard from many in the community prior to today's meeting. And so I'm going to go over those questions. And then I saw that there were several questions coming in from the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. If we cannot answer them today, we will take your questions and we will draft a response that we'll send to you. We'll take down your information from the chat, as well as all of this information, including the pre-submitted questions and new questions that we get today will be posted on our webpage. So the first question is, what is the ownership structure? Is it condo, co-op, rental only? And again, the ownership structure would be determined by the developer or community association. These could be for purchase, for rental, these could be co-op. Again, it depends on how everything is set up with the development community and how they want to have their product offering. We are not making that determination within the zoning regulation amendment, but we hope that there's a mix of for sale as well as rental opportunities. Is it strictly an affordable housing option, or will high-end housing options also be encouraged or discouraged? I mean, again, as I said in the presentation, it is strictly an affordable housing. The legislation is aimed to provide missing middle affordable housing options. Again, you can have a high-end option, but then at that point, we would be looking for 20% MIHUs to be involved with that. So in some ways, we're looking to discourage high-end and really encourage more missing middle infill development. And these, given their size limitation, would tend to lean toward more naturally affordable. It would really be dependent on what amenities are inside the home and what additional amenities are in the community. Will it require a new zoning classification? Would it use overlay zones? So this proposal does not have any new zoning classifications. These would be allowed in the districts, as we've discussed throughout the presentation, using the optional design project process for these particular projects. So again, it would be based on what's submitted that goes in for DAP review, and then how planning board approve the plan themselves. So it gives a lot of flexibility to the developer to come in and be creative with these communities within the parameters outlined within the zoning regulation amendment proposed. Are there any plans to widen its use to families, single parents, what would that option create? A beneficial cohabitation choice for residents. So right now, the legislation as it stands is for age-restricted adult housing for people 55 years and older. Children younger than 18 may not reside in the units for more than 90 days per calendar year. However, once this is adopted or even via planning board, I mean, so if you believe that this should be expanded beyond age restricted, I mean, I think that's a comment to bring to planning board, and have them forward potential to county council. Again, this will be going to county council, so this is, doesn't stop with the planning board decision. But the idea was to dip our toe in with this for age-restricted adult housing choices, and then, if it seems to be successful, there's more of a need for it, this can always be expanded through another zoning regulation amendment or through comprehensive rezoning to amend our code to allow cottage clusters to go beyond that limitation. How does this fit into recommendations of Hoco by design? So again, we looked at our general plans dynamic neighborhoods chapter, which is supportive of providing attainable and diverse housing options. It does emphasize creating more diverse housing options through the county by increasing housing affordability and ensuring that housing options for older adults, disabled populations, and those with special needs are provided. And this is supported by our dynamic neighborhoods as well as our quality by design chapter as well. Why do we have an acreage maximum and no minimum? So the minimum actually is 20,000 square feet, so this cannot be put on properties less than 20,000 square feet. With one parking space per unit, how will this affect neighborhood street parking when a cluster of homes might have car ownership beyond one vehicle per home? So currently the calculation is based on 1.3 cars per unit. So if you have 4 units, you would have 6 off-street parking spaces that would be required. So this is in comparison though to single family residential, which we only require 2.5 off-street parking spaces per unit. So, in many ways, this is in line with that ratio, the similar ratio, given the size of house and the amount of people determined to live there. Again, when you look at most single family residences, they could have 2 to 3 or even 4 cars, depending on if you're a family with 2 grown children and you're a car dependent household. So really the ratio, given the size of the unit, is really no different than what we require for single family detached and single family residential. How do we uphold the requirements to ensure families with younger children don't move in and cause hidden density and school overcrowding? So again, as we said earlier, this would be done through our ARAH regulations, which indicate how the age requirements would be upheld. Again, cottage cluster dwellings are limited to age-restricted adult housing, and the petition must include copies of proposed deed restrictions or covenants that are established how the age restrictions required under the definition of age restricted adult housing will be implemented and maintained. So again, same thing we do today for our age restricted adult housing. So no changes there. Will an existing structure have to remain, or can an investor come and buy a property, tear down the existing home and build one of these communities? So that can happen today. I mean, anyone can tear down a home that, they choose to build something different if the zoning allows for it. That can happen today. So no, an existing structure does not have to remain on site and can be torn down should anyone want to do so, as long as they meet the zoning qualifications of the district, then that would be permissible. Is there an Apfo test for schools and infrastructure? So again, the age-restricted adult housing does not require Apfo schools testing because no students will be generated from these developments. But they would be subject to a roads test, just as any other age-restricted adult housing would be, and housing allocation test as well. So again, just as we do now for our age-restricted adult housing, we would treat these the same way. How does the homeowners association requirement work for a cluster community inside a neighborhood that does not have an HOA? So this cluster of homes would be subject to their own HOA within that space of the project area. So the petition shall establish, how the age restrictions required under the definition will be used, implemented and maintained over time, because the idea is this is common land ownership. So each property will not have its own property owner, it would be communal property. So again, just as we wouldn't do it in any other community, that's how these HOAs would be established for the units that are in the common courtyard scheme. How does this affect existing properties that have agreements not to build upon or expand due to environmental protection agreements signed when part of said existing property was previously sold for development? You would not be able to construct upon environmentally protected land. These covenants would still be in place. So again, just as we would today, this doesn't change any of our existing laws that are on the books with regards to those items. What area within the county is being considered with these options? I think we went over that a lot with the various different maps. So again, they would be permitted through the optional design project process, in the districts that we described earlier in the presentation. Can there be any units with garages? I mean, there could be units with garages. This will vary how the development is constructed. However, the garages would be counted to the building footprint. So, it would be really discouraged because that would really eat into the overall living space of the unit itself. Can there be a stipulation for self-sufficiency and ability to contribute to the common good? And so I don't know if this person who submitted this question is online, but we'd be happy to try to address that question, but we really need more clarity with regard to what the question is. So we'd be happy to chat offline about what is meant by this particular question. Would this be an HO6 insurance policy situation and treated like a condo where all exterior maintenance is covered? Again, this would be up to the individual developer and how they choose to set up the structure of this particular community. And that would not be determined by the zoning regulation. This would be based on the private developer and contract with the purchaser or rental of the property. All right, will the focus group invited, concerns of the group be acknowledged, and the builder pay attention or build whatever they had in mind from the get-go? So there will be multiple touch points for this plan for the community to review. Obviously, we have with all of our plans a pre-submission meeting with DPZ would be required as outlined in county code, as well as a pre-submission meeting with the community as outlined in county code would be required. And a lot of times we don't hear about the pre-submission community meeting and how it went until after they've requested the signage and the posting for it to go out. So the community many times is much more aware because DPZ does not attend pre-submission community meetings. And that is an opportunity to get that plan out there in the public prior to it even coming through our doors for an official review. As well as DAP meetings are streamed and that can be reviewed as well as comments submitted there. And then through the planning board process as well, since this will be a process that goes before planning board through a public hearing, that would also be an opportunity. And planning board has the say on whether these plans are approved with modifications or denied. So again, there'll be multiple touch points for this to go through a public process. Will this be quality construction or glorified shed design? So again, with the optional design plan, this would require going to the design advisory panel according to code prior to the submission of the site development plan. So the petitioner shall have to provide documentation to show compliance with the criterion. And part of that criterion is submitting elevation design and drawings. So I don't believe these will be a glorified shed. However, could these be modularly constructed? Absolutely. Modular design and modularly built units actually came down from the state, a state law that zoning districts cannot prohibit those or discriminate those against stick-built development. So that's something that we do allow in all of our current residential zoning districts, is to have modular units be allowed for residential development. If these are at ground level, what steps will be taken to protect from cold, dampness, and insect infestation? Will there be supplemental heated flooring? Again, that would be dependent on the developer. However, these will still be subject to Howard County building codes that are maintained by the Department of Inspections, Licensing, and Permits. So they have to meet all county code development building standards, including being sprinkled, which is Maryland law as well. Will kitchens be designed for practicality and safety? And so again, these developments shall incorporate universal design features as proposed. And the petition shall include descriptions of the design features, proposed dwellings to demonstrate their appropriateness for the age-restricted population. And so that will be part of that process, to be able to be functional with wider doorways, light switches that are accessible, things like that. Zero step ingresses were applicable. So all the things that would make it practically designed for an aging population. Will utilities be placed toward the interior so that outdoor taps do not affect piping? Again, they would be subject to all building codes maintained by Department of Inspection, Licensing, and Permitting. Will there be proper storage? 900 square feet is the max. Would you consider increasing to 1,000 square feet? So the overall size of the unit may be expanded, and there can be some variances that are allowed with this. However, community structures may also be provided within the development. So we didn't make provisions for accessory structures to allow, perhaps if the developer of this property would want to have a storage type shed facility built for communal use. That's something that could be part of this site development plan that's submitted. On what land will these be constructed? Next to a highway, over a landfill, the usual places elders are pigeonholed. So again, it depends on where the developer chooses to build these cottage cluster communities, what land is available at the time of the development proposal. And so again, we've talked and showed a map about where these optional design projects within these zoning districts are allowed. A question came in about water, about well and septic. All of these projects would have to be built within the planned service area on public water and sewer. So would the 10,000 square foot septic reserve area size still be required for a home under 900 square feet? And again, so these communities are not going to be allowed outside of the planned service area. Do you have examples of cottage clusters that use private systems? And again, this is the first of its kind in Howard County. We don't have cottage clusters, and we don't have any examples at this time. But again, the idea is that this will be in the planned service area. So having a private system would not be allowed, because they will be in the planned service area, have to be on public water and sewer. All right, final two questions from the submitted questions, and we have a few minutes then at that time to go over some of the questions we received in the chat. So with that, would the county be responsible for the maintenance of a system or the cottage cluster? So again, at this time, these communities will be limited to the planned service area, so that will not be a concern. And what advantages or disadvantages do you see the county permitting office or the environmental health department allowing cottage clusters to be permitted in a private system? A lot of questions about private systems, totally understandable. But again, at this time, these communities will be limited to the planned service area. So that concludes the presentation portion and all of these submitted questions that we have. And with that, we will take, I'll stop sharing my screen and we will take the questions that we have from the chat. So our chat monitors.
Yes. Thank you all who participated and had the additional follow-up. We'll try to go through some of these right now, and anything not answered, we can reach out directly to you. So one of the questions that we had from one of the attendees is talking about square footage, and the square footage of the house larger than 900 square feet would mean that there would be stairs, whether it would be a basement, stairs going down to a basement, or stairs going up to an attic, and how that is conducive to aging in place. So the legislation requires the development to incorporate the universal design standards from the planning and zoning guidelines. So the 900 square foot footprint could allow for a basement or second floor. However, the universal design standards require complete living area on the first floor. So that would include master bedroom, bath, everything on the first floor level. We had questions about the acreage of the properties, asking where there is a 10-acre site. So the ZRA is not specific, but the 10 acres is the maximum lot size a cottage cluster age restrictive adult housing development could be utilized under the optional design project. So this could be a culmination of adjoining lots that could be merged together. However, the development could not exceed the 10-acre lot size. Further questions about how the courtyard would work on a 10-acre site or a smaller cottage cluster development. So the legislation requires a courtyard size of 250 square feet per dwelling unit in the development. So the design of the cottage cluster development is guided by the bulk requirements, including setbacks and minimum maximum development sizes and the common courtyard size. So that's all part of the design standard that the consultant or the developer would have to meet, and then it would be reviewed by our design advisory panel and also presented to the planning board for final approval. We had a question about why the units are all age restricted. It would seem that a small family could live in one of these, or a single parent or child. I believe Linda had touched on that in the presentation and in the questions.
So I see a question from Fran Lopresti.
Mhm.
Why 900 square feet? Where did this number come from? So this number came from a couple places. So one was actually the state. So this year, the state was proposing legislation for silver and starter homes. And they defined cottage cluster. Actually, I believe they defined it as 800 square feet. We were looking at other definitions from publications that we have in best practices and determined 900 square feet might be a little more suitable for our needs. And so that's where that number came from, was a mixture of the state and then best practices for the size of a cottage unit.
So thank you for filling us in as we're getting questions as we're reading. We had a question about, are there any cottage clusters currently proposed for development? So no, we don't have any cottage clusters that are currently in review by county staff. This legislation would add them. So right now, cottage clusters aren't an option in our zoning regulations. So these regulations or this legislation would allow that opportunity.
So another question from Kevin Murray asked if cottage clusters will be part of the Gateway project. So it could be, that's yet to be determined. We are working on what the zoning for Gateway will be at this time. And so that's to be determined. However, you know, there is housing that will be part of the Gateway plan, and this definitely could be one of the options that would be permitted.
Okay, we have a question about from David Brown. Given that Hoco is an old, not just aging community, how do existing houses with HC subsidized aging in place modifications fit into the age-restrictive adult housing model? Can a three-story townhouse with an elevator be absorbed in a future amendment to the definition? And more generally, is there a backfit path negotiated with an existing HOA, or is this new development with or is this only new development with a new HOA? So the cottage clusters are intended as smaller homes to support affordability. So any type of amendment that would allow a three-story townhouse with an elevator really wouldn't provide the affordability option that we're looking for with this legislation. However, amendments to the ZRA can occur during the legislative process, future zoning regulation amendments, or through the comprehensive zoning process. In cottage clusters, in order to be considered a cottage cluster, you would need to meet the definition and the design requirements. If the cottage cluster is not a rental community under single ownership, an entity such as an HOA must be established to maintain and enforce age restrictions. So the legislation does not specify how the HOA organization would run. So I guess there is a possibility that an existing HOA could include this area or a future development project in their overall HOA organizational scheme. Another question from David Brown: is there an overall plan covering housing affordability in the unhoused and first-time buyers as well as aging residents? So these topics are more discussed in the Howard County Housing Opportunities Master Plan and our general plan, Hoco by Design. And both of those plans are available on the planning and zoning webpage.
And if I may add, I would also suggest Department of Housing and Community Development has a housing plan as well, and they have their annual housing plan. So that would be the best opportunity to review what's proposed from their end. Andy Stack had a question about right now, optional design project only applies to the CR zoning. The regulation moves that requirement. Does this mean that the optional design project capability will be available in all zoning districts? So not really. So yes, you're correct that optional design only applies to the CR district. ZRA 222 removes it out of the CR district and also applies it to the Route 1 corridor. That is going to County Council now. That was heard at the Planning Board back in February, I believe, March, regarding that zoning regulation amendment. This does the same thing. Again, it takes and changes the definition of where it can be applied. However, in both cases, there are limitations of where optional design projects can be applied. In the case of zoning regulation 222, it's only those facing the Route 1 corridor that meet certain criteria. And in this zoning regulation amendment, it's only to be utilized in the zoning districts where we allow age-restricted adult housing as a conditional use and only for cottage cluster.
We had a question from Carter. As we were doing research for the zoning regulation amendment, did you encounter any examples of jurisdictions where developers are building a good number of cottage clusters? I'm not aware of any. I know Linda had talked about different jurisdictions such as Anne Arundel County with the tiny houses and stuff. Yep, but
I think they're more popular than this.
I will say, I believe Warman's Mill though, in Frederick County is an example where they do have some cottage clusters within the larger developed area. So, and that's been around, I think, since the late 90s, early 2000s.
okay. Dr. Francisco Ward, is the porch structure included in the 900 square foot footprint? So the footprint would include any structure as viewed from directly above that would be covered. So yes, it would be considered the 900 square foot footprint. Dale Davis, is there a lot of examples around the country that use sustainable technologies to reduce the cost of ownership after purchase? Is your team looking into any of these options for future development? Are you looking at best practices from around the country of affordable small footprint home communities?
So again, with that one, as far as the sustainable technologies to reduce the cost of home ownership, I mean, the county does have some robust solar programs. I believe, you know, that those would be allowed on the individual unit for rooftop solar. Also, there's community solar options for an individual person to purchase into. We have not looked into any options regarding this particular development style for additional sustainable technologies. That would be really determined upon who the developer is and how they want to implement that. But we're always encouraging of those types of options in our built environment. And so I think, you know, to that point, I mean, I think that's very interesting, something that we could look into just for our own particular resources.
And then I think Lisa is expanding on one of her questions that she submitted beforehand. That we said that we needed more information to help. She said what she had meant was that the age restriction had some sort of upper bound, ensuring that they would need to be self-sufficient and able to contribute to participate. In addition, if ambulances arrive on a regular basis, this would also be an issue in terms of disruption, traffic flow, etc.
So we can't discriminate on who lives in a particular home based on their age. That, you know, the developer, we can set a minimum for age restricted, but if someone feels that they are able to live independently, that's up to that particular person to make that determination. It's not a zoning issue. I'm not sure what you mean by a time frame in mind. If you're talking about the zoning regulation amendment, the time frame is that this goes to planning board on Thursday. Will be filed with council on April 23rd for their consideration in May for June adoption. And then regarding the floor plans, those floor plans are just examples. Those are not the floor plans we're requiring developers to build. Because you said you didn't see any laundry facilities as part of the floor plan. And so again, that would be up to how each individual unit is built. And they can be put in something as small as a stackable on top, a stackable washer, dryer, and a closet. So though you didn't see this facility, doesn't mean that they aren't available in individual units.
And then Mr. Droll Horowitz had a question about, as units increase, courtyards get larger and larger, how physically have a courtyard with 20 units or multiple acres? So I think, you know, courtyards have to be present. This is a design function on which a consultant or developer would provide the design that they believe fits best. And just an important thing to note is that the regulations don't require a single courtyard. You could have, if you had 20 units, you could have multiple courtyards within that community that houses are arranged again, versus a larger courtyard area with each house around that. So the legislation really does provide design flexibility. Are we missing any?
I think we've covered most everything. I mean, there's some additional questions from Mr. Horowitz about is the MIH unit. Pardon me?
Another one coming in.
I think we have time for like one more question. And then this will be it because it's after 5 and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. There are a lot of examples around the country. I think we've already.
Yeah, he just mentioned the Ross Street
Okay.
work.
Yeah.
Which is featured on our website.
Yep,
So
perfect.
that's great.
Thank you for that information. All right, well, with that, we're going to go ahead and end today's webinar. This information, as well as follow-up to the questions, will be posted on our webpage. Thank you all for your time today. I really appreciate you all being here.
Yeah, and I think that if, you know, as you absorb this information or maybe review the presentation again, questions can be sent to the planning@howardcountymd.gov email address, and we will provide a response through there
All right,
for
I'd
any,
like
for any questions not answered.
Yep. Thank you
Yep.
all, and thank you to staff for your support today, and we look forward to hearing from you all. Take care, have a great one. Bye-bye.